Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War news update. First one thereof for the 21st of November 2024, if you exclude my breaking news update on intercontinental ballistic missiles flying across Europe. On the other side of Europe, look, some lovely snow out the back of my house. That is very rare for the south coast of the UK. And although it hasn't really settled, and that's the end of that now, it was dumping quite nicely and I got rather excited. But back in the stark reality of the war, let's look at the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply. Of course, we have some pretty high losses for the Russians still. 1,510 personnel lost in a single day is a huge number still, although slightly less than the last few days. 8 tanks is pretty much the daily average. 24 troop-carrying AFVs is above the daily average. And 50 artillery systems, very high number there, about 2.5 times the daily average. For that category, 1 multiple launch rocket system and 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems. It's good to see those on the list. And 97 vehicles and fuel tanks is insanely high, probably because the Russians are using them quite a lot to do their attacks as well. No piece of special equipment today. Can be quite a variable category, that. No Andrew Perpetual loss list, but we do have some videos to share and some information about losses. So remember, these losses in terms of personnel almost certainly include killed, wounded, deserted and captured. Paratroopers of the 80th Brigade captured 26 POWs in one combat in the Kursk zone. 2 fighters from the Storm Z unit, former prisoners, share their story. After signing a contract and undergoing 10 days of training, they were sent into battle but managed to surrender. Well, PS01 talks about this. Quotes from a Russian source saying, yesterday more than 20 of our fighters from the 26th Tank Regiment of the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade were allegedly captured near Martinovka, and most of them were former prisoners. That's just north of Suzhye in the Kursk Oblast, or Kursk sector. Most of them were former prisoners for whom this was their first real assault. In addition, at least 8 armoured vehicles were lost. Many guys died, and all because of the lack of quality reconnaissance and, as a result, poor planning. The guys from the regiment write that this attack was, in fact, reconnaissance. Again, in short, 25. Again, negligence of commanders. They do not care of either people or equipment. And after this, they themselves are fine and continue to hold their positions and continue to dispose of lives. This is looking pretty bad for the Russians up in the Kursk region, where although they are taking land back, it is quite slow going at the moment, all things considered. And that being that they have 50,000 odd troops up there, and they are getting absolutely hammered. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that the attrition rate of the Russians up in the Kursk sector is pretty horrendous. There's a video here, I can't really show you it, dead people and whatnot, but paratroopers of the 95th Brigade of Ukraine in Kursk once again defeated the Russian detachment, in this case 14 people, of the Marines of the 810th Assault Brigade. So the 810th is a Marines unit that is getting absolutely hammered up in the Kursk region. Sorry, I can't show you that. And they have had insane attrition rates there. As supposedly a crack unit, but they are no longer a crack unit, let's face it. But Andrew Perpetual was talking about them the other day, saying that actually, yeah, they are getting an absolute beasting. Here we have evidence of another T-90M. That's their best tank here, with an elaborate cope cage on top being taken out. That's the end of that tank in a Prokrosk direction. What else is there to show? Not particularly significant, but it's always good when you see a Russian military vehicle get into trouble outside of the military zones as well. So this is in Belgorod, where an armoured vehicle smashed into a civilian car. It happened on Sunday, but authorities tried to hush it up until this photo from Krocha was published. There's no word on casualties, of course. Okay, we're going to move on to distant strikes, and it has been quite a newsworthy night. So first of all, Ukrainian Air Force reported on a missile strike early this morning. They shot down 6 out of 7 KH-101 cruise missiles. They didn't shoot down the Kinzhal aero ballistic missile that was sent, but they add that there are no significant consequences. What's interesting there are no Shahids that I'm aware of. That is the first time for, well, I think we had one day out of like the last over a month, but essentially every night has been a case of anywhere from sort of 30 to near enough 100 drones sent. And to have a night of no drones is, I think, a very good sign for Ukraine. Now, before we talk about the intercontinental ballistic missile, if it was indeed that, let's remember that de-escalation requires the attacker to attack less, not the victim to defend less. The only de-escalation needs to happen is Russia pulling out of Ukraine. So don't see ATACMS and Storm Shadows as escalatory, since Russia's been doing that themselves the other way for 2.5 years. Absolutely nonsense to think that's escalatory. Anyway, the Ukrainian Air Force claims an intercontinental ballistic missile was launched by Russia from Astrakhan region. In the last few days, rumours were spreading about the possible launch of the RS-26 Rubezh. Air Force shared no specific details initially. But there is this understanding US and Russia have an agreement to notify each other of ICBM launches. Raises the question of whether Russia notified the US of the RS-26 use, and if that's why the embassy was closed yesterday. So the American embassy closed, the Spanish, Italian and Greek embassies also closed. Could it be that they were actually notified of this missile being launched or about to be launched? Or was it that the US picked it up through intel, interceptions? Was it likely intentional? Did they look at signs of Russian preparation, so on and so forth? So some discussion to be had around that. It's interesting, though, the claim this morning, and in my breaking news update, was this is an intercontinental ballistic missile being used. A Western official has told ABC News that Russia did not use an ICBM against Ukraine last night, contradicting Ukraine's Air Force. The official said it was a ballistic missile, but declined to characterize it further, saying the impact was still being assessed. Now, this could be trying to distinguish between an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, which is a truly long-range missile, and an IRBM, which is an intermediate-range ballistic missile. Possibly something like a Kinjal, was that, or maybe shorter range than that. This is a missile that was used to a range of, I don't know, Dnipro Prokrosk is 100 kilometers from the front line. Let's assume they fired it from Russia, I don't know, 200 to 300 kilometers, something like that. Well, that's a sort of ATACMS range. And although they keep getting named as long-range missiles, ATACMS, they're not really. They're kind of medium range. So, okay, it might not be an ICBM, it might be an IRBM. But as I think Edward Hunter Christie pointed out, I don't know if I have that observation. It's like, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is that it can carry a nuclear warhead. So that's what's significant about this. This is a bit of nuclear saber rattling. Anyway, Shashi and Joshi said, I'd be inclined to put more weight on American assessments over the Ukrainian ones. In this particular instance, the US had forewarning. Potentially, it would have been watching the Kasputin Yar facility very closely and would have seen detailed signs and the launch and trajectory. But yes, so that took place, and it looked rather like this, where you had these different arrays of, I would say, warheads, but they're not necessarily warheads. We don't quite know what it was that came out. You have what are called MIRVs, and that's the worrying part about this missile. It's not necessarily the range, but it's the ability to have MIRVs, which can split into separate warheads. But there are some claims that they weren't actually warheads, that they were kind of weight simulators. I don't know that there were huge explosions where they hit, and whether the damage was just done through kinetic impact. During a morning attack on the Dnipro on November the 21st, Russians struck for the first time with the RS-26 Rubezh intercontinental ballistic missile, says Special Kherson Cat. The maximum declared range of the RS-26, if it was indeed that, is 6,000 kilometers. Dnipro is 100 kilometers from the front line, as mentioned earlier. And yeah, MIRV, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. But some are saying that if they could use warheads on there, they would. Some are also saying that it's actually quite difficult to have those warheads on board. I mean, part of the problem of an intercontinental ballistic missile is the speed with which it re-enters the atmosphere, and actually it's very difficult to have warheads on board. So it might be that it's unable to carry those multiple warheads. It could, I don't know. I don't know enough about this subject to cast any definitive conclusion. But it appears not to have had warheads, and that's either that they couldn't, or for some reason didn't want to. I don't know. Were they so desperate to fire it that they just fired one that wasn't really properly armed? I don't know. According to international treaties, as mentioned, that you should give that warning, and we wonder whether the warning was given or whether it was found out by intelligence. So I'm not aware that Russia has developed a functioning warhead for an ICBM range missile, be it the RS-26 or a different one, says Fabian Hoffman. These RVs are most likely filled with a weight simulator or are left empty. In any case, the military utility of these strikes will have been meaningless, as they are most likely not accurate enough, and that's quite the signal, though. So the idea is that this is a signal to the Ukrainians and possibly the Americans. So, okay, we'll come on to that in a second. Euromaidan Press says Russia hits Dnipro with ICBM, followed by an aero ballistic and cruise missiles, injuring 2. So I don't know what caused this damage, but if this damage was caused by the ICBM or whatever that was, then it's not that significant. Which indicates that probably didn't have warheads on board, but I don't know. It impacts one of the rods of the Russian ICBM RS-26 launched this morning at the city of Dnipro. State Emergency Services of Ukraine regarding the damage caused by the attack. In the morning, the enemy attacked Dnipro. 2 people were wounded, and it's worth noting, typically for the Russians here, the building of the rehabilitation center for people with disabilities was damaged. So not only was it not that militarily effective, but it's like, what did you damage? Oh, rehabilitation center for disabled people. Couldn't be more on point for the Russians there, really. That is exactly what they often do. The boiler room was partially destroyed. The windows were broken. Fire broke out in 2-story residential building on the territory of the private sector. Roof on an area of 150 meters were on fire. Also in the city, an industrial enterprise and a garage cooperative were damaged. On the territory of which a fire broke out, an area of 100 square meters, 9 garages were partially destroyed. So that is the damage that was done. Now, Edward Hunter Christie said Moscow's gambit may be to raise the stakes directly in the eyes of the United States just in time for Trump to pose as a fake savior. It's the Cuba deception plan, making America think this is a missile crisis, not a criminal invasion, which justifies hitting Russia and beating it. I wonder whether today, when America wakes up, you will have all sorts of people from the GOP going, oh my goodness, he told you what would happen. Oh my goodness, as soon as Trump comes in, he's going to stop all of this. And this will instead of looking at Russia and saying, what are you doing, Russia? That's absolutely horrific. Why are you sending an ICBM into Ukraine? Instead of blaming them, blame Ukraine and the Biden administration, and it would be an absolute fustercluck. It will be, if that's what happens, then you know exactly whose side the Trump administration will be on when they come into power. If they blame all of this on Biden and the Ukrainians and exonerate the Russians, then that's all you need to know. So watch out for what the rhetoric will be today. That will give you the indication. Now, in the Astrakhan region, Akhtubinsk, explosions took place following a Ukrainian drone attack. So I don't know whether they were flying things back towards where that launcher was. But anyway, drones in that area. Drones were spotted this morning in the skies over Russia. The exact location is difficult to determine. Some people saying Akhtubinsk, home of the 929th State Flight Test Center, crucial strategic Russian target for the Ukrainians. It conducts testing of all types of aircraft and drones, plus new variations of weapons systems. And that was where the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile was sent from. Could be why you are seeing drones there today. Now, in terms of the strikes on the ammo depot from the night before, or from when the ATACMS struck it, goodness me, is that 3 nights ago now? I don't know. Daniela from Tochny wrote about this. So when I wrote this, I knew this was a crucial target since the Russian used an incredible amount of resources into building it. So that is this site that was struck by those 6 out of 8 ATACMS supposedly. So the attack on the 13th Arsenal GRAU near Kotovo, Novgorod Oblast, around 500 kilometers from Ukraine, was recently renovated and reinforced as a facility Class 3 per Hartree Fox, per Daniela's classification. So Class 3 designation, sites in this class show significant changes in the ammunition storage facilities, in particular new ECMs and AGMs. So that's where they can build them into either kind of revetments or build defensive kind of bunkers around the ammunition. With embankments and barricades have been constructed. However, for logistical reasons or due to space requirements, these facilities tend to still use open-air stockpiles, usually protected on three sides by simple embankments. These sites are to be considered the most valuable ones since they often have a significant number of ECMs compared to low-tier sites. Why it was that the ATACMS were sent there, it's because evidently ammo depots are valuable targets for the Ukrainians. And I presume they learned that from hitting those ammo depots previously and that having some tangible effect on frontline stocks of munitions. So that's what we saw. Anyway, Russian strikes, the point being that they've put a lot of work into refurbishing that site, indicates that it's a valuable site, is what Daniela's saying there, as far as I can understand it. Okay. Euromaidan Press reports that Russian strikes on the Ukrainian nuclear power plants could cause a nuclear disaster. Attacks on power substations threaten to disrupt cooling systems at Ukraine's nuclear facilities, risking a large-scale radiological event. So it could be a way of striking a nuclear power station without striking a power station and having plausible deniability over that's what you were originally trying to do. So, you can cause a nuclear power plant to melt down due to infrastructure around it being hit or kind of up the road being taken out so that, cooling systems don't work or there's a system overload or whatever it is. A bit of a worry there for the Ukrainians. Now, Russia is constructing aircraft shelters on the territory of Krymsk Air Base in Krasnodar Krai, southern Russia. Krymsk is home to the 3rd Guards Mixed Aviation Regiment and the 4th Air and Air Defense Army, operating Su-27 SM-3s and Su-30 M2 fighter jets. This is evidence of worry that the Ukrainians can hit these with, I presume, cluster munitions and maybe unitary warheads or whatever, but trying to protect. And you could argue, and the Russians have, this is long overdue. Russian mill bloggers have said, why haven't we got protection for our jets on air bases? Why haven't we had that hitherto? And it's been really short-sighted from the Russians. And had the Ukrainians had the ability to strike these air bases sooner, then they could have had much greater effect. Now, of course, the Russians are busily preparing. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces, just to pop back into what's been going on. Swedish Navy is present. So what's been going on with the undersea cables being severed. Swedish Navy is present in the Baltic Sea where the cables have suffered damage. This type of event, quote, this type of event has all the signs of hybrid warfare, says the Navy's press chief, Jimmy Adamson. Jimmy Anderson, he's one of the greatest test bowlers of all time in the English cricket side. Anyway, Jimmy Adamson is someone else, said that to SVT. You have all sorts going on around the world. So you've got ICBMs, you've got ATACMS, Storm Shadows, you've got a war that's been going on for 2.5 to 3 years, and you've got almost 3 years actually coming up for. And then you've got hybrid warfare going on across Europe and indeed in the US as well. Don't forget that there have been sites in the US that have been targeted by the Russians, and you've got an incoming administration that appears to be pro-Russian, and you've got confusion around much of the world as to whether Russia are the good guys or bad guys, and it just blows my mind. These guys are just causing problems all over the shop. Terrible. Right, yet again, the Russians have been involved in executions. 2 executions in as many days. They conducted a field execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Date and location unknown, but there looks to be at least 8 of them. 2, 4, 6, 8. I think maybe 9. I think there's another one down there who get executed. Absolutely horrific. And then we have 2 more who were executed subsequently in a different incident. Photo shows 2 soldiers who were stripped naked and shot dead near Donetsk, Prokrosk area. They were the prosecutors are investigating reports of the murder of 3 more wounded soldiers by Russia. So that's actually 3 incidents then over over the last 3 days. I don't know what else I can say about that other than moral monsters. Right, Ukraine is to pursue diplomatic liberation of Crimea and will not acknowledge occupied territories as Russian, according to Zelensky. Now, here's quite an admission from Zelensky. We cannot spend dozens of thousands of our people so that they perish for the sake of Crimea coming back. In other words, there is no hope anymore of a military liberation of Crimea. It will have to be done diplomatically. That is a big admission there. Let me know what you think about that. All sorts of stuff going on with regard to the ICBM incident. So just go and check the socials. You got Makarova, the spokeswoman for the Russians, saying the American missile defense base in Poland has long been among the priority targets for potential destruction by Russian troops. So she, I don't know if it was a parody, but she took a phone call at the beginning of this, and I don't know, someone had subtitles, don't talk about the ballistic missile, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know whether that was a joke or whether that was literally what was actually heard on the phone call and her saying, yeah, okay. But anyway, it's interesting that she has said that the American missile defense base in Poland has long been among the priority targets for destruction by Russian troops. And when you have the new administration coming in, you get this kind of talk, which is, yeah, we have long considered this American base in Poland one of our targets. Like, what does that tell you? This kind of Russian appeasement makes no sense to me. Le Monde have reported that Ukraine's defense spending is 35% of the GDP, which is comparable to France's spending during World War One. But Russia's spending on the war much less, so certainly against as a percentage of GDP. So they are spending an estimated 8% of GDP. At the same time, Ukraine's civil services are operating normally thanks to finance assistance from the EU, which covers half of the national budget. We're going to come on to this in a second, quite a bit on the Russian economy, but I think it's interesting that while the Ukrainians are spending 35% of GDP on the war, they are fully invaded. Their whole country is, under pressure from an invading force in a way that Russia is not. Russia are on a war footing, but only 8% of GDP being spent on the war. If that's accurate, but I would argue Ukraine is possibly functioning better than Russia at the moment. So let's talk about that. Anton Gerashchenko says Russia's economy is struggling to sustain a war effort amidst soaring interest rates and growing dependence on China, says The Economist. Despite sanctions, the economy has grown over the past 2 years due to increased military spending. However, this honeymoon period is ending as interest rates have hit a record high 21%. The strain on Russian finances is evident, with 40% of next year's budget earmarked for defense and security. The Russian states, that's different from the percentage of GDP, but as a percentage of the budget, they're going to spend 40% of their budget on the war next year, earmarked for defense and security. The Russian state is already deeply behind on payments to its suppliers. They have taken to the internet to complain that they haven't received the money for deliveries made 6 to 9 months ago, with new orders while new orders are still coming in. Spending big on military is quite expected when a country is at war, but for Russia there are several factors at play that prevent them from indefinitely increasing their military budget. During World War II, the UK and US kept interest rates at 2.5 to 3% to manage large deficits affordably. In contrast, Russia's interest rate and sovereign debt yields have surged from 6% pre-war to about 16% now. So that spending and borrowing is costing the Russians an awful lot of money, costing the state an awful lot of money. Inflation in Russia exceeds 8%, prompting the central bank to raise interest rates to cool the economy, a standard anti-inflationary move, but ill-suited for wartime. Alternative measures like higher personal taxes or rationing, which could curb inflation while keeping rates low, are politically untenable for Putin as they conflict with the state propaganda and risk public discontent. So you can't say we're going to ration to keep inflation down, we're going to ration the nation, because the nation will go, we didn't ask for this, what's going on? And it'd be like politically suicidal. So unlike the American Lend-Lease program that supplied the UK with the military equipment and resources such as oil and food essentially for free, China charges high price for its support of Russia. This weakens the ruble-yuan exchange rate and forces Russia to maintain high interest rates. Initial domestic subsidies for borrowers offered a temporary fix but have now been suspended, leading to a sharp drop in mortgages and a forecasted rise in corporate bankruptcies. With a sharp economic slowdown expected next year, financing the war will become even more challenging for Putin, particularly if he seeks to stabilise the ruble. And here we have Samolet Group's stock, the biggest developer in the Russian Federation, is down 70% in the last 400 days. It will probably go bankrupt in a few months. What next? Commercial banks going under? So things are not looking good. Sberbank looking like it wants to puke and crash. We have VTB Bank, doesn't look that bad. Long wicks down and somewhat good buy volume, but still nothing fancy. And Promsvyaz Bank, which serves mainly the defense industry, is puking hard. So things are not looking good in the development, in the developer sector, but also in the banking sector as well. 5 days ago, the ruble lost its battle with 100, and now it's off to the races, says Jay in Kiev, and it is now over 101 rubles to the dollar, which is that a ruble is worth less than 1 cent. It is tanking. It's not in a good place. Now, some of the price rises for Russia, says Tim Wright, in 2024 so far, with still 12% of the year remaining. These are official Rosstat figures. So these are the official ones. You can imagine that they will be at least worse than this. Potatoes, plus 73%. Onions, plus 33%. Butter, plus 30%. Cabbage, plus 26%. Beetroot, plus 25%. Lamb, plus 21%. Milk, plus 15%. Beef, plus 11%. The signs are, writings on the wall. Now, Steve Rosenberg, a BBC journalist still in Moscow, says today's Russian papers are on today's economic problems in Russia. Butter 30% more expensive than last year. Price of potatoes up 65%. Plus the ruble falls plus 100 against the dollar. And Chinese banks tighten payments, checks on payments. Wow. This is what Steve Rosenberg
Well, today's
has to
Russian
say.
papers reflect today's economic problems in Russia. Beginning with inflation. Front page of Nezavisime Gazeta. Some products have gone up in price this year by tens of percent. In October, butter was 6.6% more expensive than in September and 30% more expensive than a year ago. The price of potatoes in October was 65% higher than last year. In sociological surveys, half of people surveyed complain about a noticeable rise in the price of dairy products. A sociologist adds, while failing to achieve its goal of lowering inflation, the Russian central bank is at the same time undermining people's financial standing, making housing and consumer goods less affordable.
So this is really interesting because Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, has actually done a really good job, all things considered, of keeping the Russian economy from being an absolute poo show. 2.5 years of war and the Russian economy is hanging on with white knuckles and by the fingertips. But it's very close to collapse, I would argue. But for her to be the fall guy, I think is deeply unfair, because the fall guy should be Putin for invading Russia. She's done the very best she could, but there are only relatively few tools, which is kind of interesting. When you look at blaming Biden for inflation, that was a global phenomenon. And you had COVID, and then you had the energy crisis from the war in Ukraine, right? But actually, the things that he did and the administration did got inflation under wraps there, below 2%. And now, the American economy is doing really well comparatively. The Russian economy is on a war footing, but there are only relatively few tools it can use to keep things under check. So she will be the fall guy, but that will be deeply unfair, really.
All of this has a negative effect on Russians' social well-being. Moskovsky Komsomolets reports that a festive favourite here, tangerines, are becoming more expensive. A year ago, they cost on average between 60 and 90 rubles a kilo. Today, it's between 100 and 150 rubles. By January, the price of the fruit, a New Year favourite, may jump 50%. Meanwhile, Russians are having to get used to the US dollar being worth more than 100 rubles. What are the consequences of a weakening ruble for Russian consumers? Some analysts claim that citizens won't feel much difference. Other analysts predict negative consequences. For example, Western goods becoming more expensive, especially before the New Year holiday. The weaker the ruble, the stronger the dollar, the higher the inflationary expectations and the higher the rise in prices. Kommersant reports that Russian airlines have suspended flights on 34 Airbus A320, A321neo aircraft. That's half of all the planes of that type in Russia. These aircraft have advanced engines, but with problems. They can't be repaired in Russia because of the difficulty in doing so. They can't be brought into the country because of sanctions and a market shortage. Finally, Izvestia reports that Chinese banks have tightened checks on payments from the United Arab Emirates, India and Hong Kong, according to representatives of Russian business. This is because of the fear of secondary sanctions. Problems with payments began at the end of December 2023, after the EU's 12th package of anti-Russian sanctions. Due to the risk of secondary sanctions, China, Turkey and the UAE began restricting settlements with Russia.
This is all good news for Ukraine, all of it. So as mentioned, in Russia, due to technical issues, half of the Airbus A321, and A321 Neo fleet has been grounded. 34 planes are out of service, some put into reserve. The issue lies in problematic engines, which can't be repaired locally or imported due to sanctions. So 34 currently sitting idle of the 66. The worst situation is with S7 airline, which does not use 31 of its 39 Airbus aircraft. Wow. And of course, good news for the Ukrainians. So we need 2 more months of Russia getting screwed over before the Trump administration comes in. If they lift sanctions, that will be utterly ridiculous because Russia are, I think, on the verge. Ukraine's best chance of winning the war starts with winning the economic war, and that will precipitate a collapse of the regime, and that's your best chance of getting Crimea back. So Zelensky notes that it's unlikely that they're going to take it back militarily, but if you have a regime change due to a massive economic collapse in Russia, then you are much more likely to see Ukraine get its 1991 borders back. So that's my opinion. Let me know if you disagree. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.